Here is a question nobody in power wants you to ask. 30 years ago, African nations were told, some were pressured, some were bribed, and some were even threatened to adopt democracy, term limits, free press, the whole package. So here is what I want you to tell me. After 30 years, after dozens of elections, billions in democracy aid, and hundreds of international observers flying business class to monitor our voting, where exactly are we? Because I went looking for answers, and what I found even surprised me more. Let's go back to the early 90s. The Cold War had just ended. Berlin Wall had come down, and suddenly the dominant Western powers had a very clear message for Africa. Democracy is the answer. Now, to be fair, some African people genuinely wanted it. After years of brutal one-party state and military coups, the ideology of choosing your own leader was deeply appealing. That part was real. But here is the part they don't teach us in textbooks. The World Bank and the IMF, the two institutions that held Africa's biggest debts in their hands, made democracy a condition. You want loans? Restructure politically. You want debt relieved? Hold elections. So when you see African countries choosing democracy in the 90s, you have to ask yourself, how much of that was choice and how much was simply the price of a loan? I'm going to give you a moment to sit down, question yourself, because the answer shapes everything that comes after. Now, from 1990 to 1998, more African countries held multi-party elections than in the entire previous century combined. 36 countries restructured their governments, new constitutions were written, parliaments were built, the donors celebrated. But the question nobody asked was, what actually changed for the person selling tomatoes on the roadside? Quick question, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Name one African country that has adopted Western-style multi-party democracy in the early 90s and is now genuinely developed. Not just stable, developed with strong infrastructure, healthcare, education, and electricity. Now, let me show you what that actual data says. Not what Western government says or what the African Union says in a press release, but the actual numbers. I want you to be careful here, because this isn't a simple story where democracy failed and authoritarian regimes won. That would be too easy. The real story is much more complicated. Now, some of these democracies built real institutions, but Ghana has transferred power peacefully for decades. Botswana has maintained strong governance. Namibia, often overlooked, has a solid democratic culture. But the pattern across the continent is hard to look at without asking some uncomfortable questions. What is the single biggest reason democracy hasn't delivered what it promised in Africa? Is it corruption, Western interference, or is it the design of the system itself? Let's look at what started changing the conversation. Now, in early 2022, a 34-year-old military captain took power in one of the so-called poorest nations on earth, Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traore. He wears his uniform everywhere, no suits, no ties. He speaks in plain language and lives modestly. According to researchers, he's arguably Africa's most popular president. How? A nuclear deal, a new international airport, a gold refinery, an agro-processing industry, and a development bank. All of this while fighting jihadists, while under EU sanctions, and while being called a dictator. Now, I want you to think about something. Think about the country near you, the one that has had elections every 5 years for 3 decades. I want to be clear, Traore is not a saint. His government has documented human rights concern and civic space is shrinking. We are not ignoring that. But here is the question this episode is really about. Why are the countries that were giving democracy struggling more than they should be? Why should some continents' most hated leaders be delivering more than expected? This is a question about fit. Was a political model designed in 18th century Europe ever really designed with Abuja, Kinshasa, or Ouagadougou in mind? There is a West African proverb. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. The West designed these systems. Africa inherited them. One side forgot the context and the other still lives with the results. In 2011, A NATO-backed coalition removed Muammar Gaddafi from power. Libya descended into chaos. Only then did people look at what he actually built: free healthcare, free education, and a great man-made river, the largest water infrastructure project in history. Before NATO went in, Libya had the highest human development index in Africa. Full stop. So the question is, are we finally breaking the habit of only understanding our builders after they are gone? It's a government that holds beautiful elections but leaves its citizens in poverty more democratic than a government that doesn't hold elections but builds hospitals, airports, and roads. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 4 decades without a single multi-party election. Rwanda under Paul Kagame went from a country destroyed by genocide to one of the cleanest, fastest growing economies on the continent. What West Africa needs is performance legitimacy. Not the theater of elections with no real accountability, but a system legitimized by results. Maybe it's taking the best of what really works, including real democratic traditions that existed in African cultures long before colonialism,